Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all at the Sustainable Care Conference, Challenges and Solutions for a Sustainable Future. My name is Magdolna Lőrinc, and I'm a research associate at the University of Sheffield. I will be chairing today's session. Now, the broad theme of today's session is inequalities in care, global, local, and transnational dynamics in an age of migration. Today's session focuses specifically on transnationality, intergenerationality, and technology. And we have a fantastic lineup of 4 exciting and thought-provoking papers on how transnational families access, negotiate, and enact care through new technologies. Now, each presentation will take 15 minutes, and after our discussant, Professor Majella Kilkey, will add some remarks on the paper. The session then will continue with a Q&A session. Now, of course, this is a pre-recorded session. However, we would like to encourage you to join our session and share your thoughts, your comments, insights, and questions with us. You will find information on the website on how to do that, and we will try to comment and answer your questions. Now, without wasting any more time, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Onallia Esther Osei is a PhD researcher at Maastricht University, and she will be talking about parent-child relationships in a Ghanaian context. Onallia, can I welcome you to this session?
I welcome you to my presentation, which is one of the empirical chapters of my PhD thesis, and it looks at sustaining Ghanaian transnational parent-child relationship through WhatsApp, a youth-centric perspective. So this is part of the Montreal project, which is at Maastricht University, and the principal investigator is Professor Valentina Mazzucato, who is also one of the writers of this paper. And we wrote this together with Dr. Karlijn Haagsman, who is also at Maastricht University. Next slide, please. So this will be the outline of the presentation. I will briefly give you some knowledge about the theories and the research methods that informs the study. And then I take you through the findings with some concluding remarks. Next slide, please. So ICTs, particularly mobile phones and social media tools, are resources and materials that have gained so much academic attention, including the Transnational Family Scholarship. According to Statista in 2017, diffusion and accessibility of new media technologies, or ICTs, rises exponentially around the world, including sending countries. During geographical separation, transnational family scholars have already established that these families stay connected through communication technologies, remittances, and visits. But among these 3, ICTs are the most accessible because they entail fewer financial resources or formal documentation as compared to remittances and home visits. Research consistently shows that ICT, particularly mobile phones, applications like FaceTime, Facebook, Skype, and SMS, sustain relationships within transnational families. And this platform allows for what Baldassar, who is one of the presenters in this meeting, terms as passive and active co-presence. And this allows for affective relationship despite the geographical separation. Interestingly, most of this knowledge is based on migrant parent perspectives, or in general, adult perspective. Hence, we see little report about children's involvement regarding ICT and transnational relationships. Although transnational families have been observed to be connected with power asymmetries, we know from the communication literature in general, and in this case, Lekoper and Smarda in 2005 found that people can negotiate such power asymmetries through ICTs. Hence, we decided to embark on this youth-centric approach research. Next slide, please. To find out how the so-called left behind children employ ICT, specifically WhatsApp, to stay connected to their parents. We look at WhatsApp not because we went into the field to focus on WhatsApp, but WhatsApp emerged from our data. That is, the young people overwhelmingly adopt and utilize this platform to stay connected intimately to their parents. WhatsApp is a free communication technology used on smartphones with internet connection. It therefore reduces one of the hurdles, which is cost, that Lam and Yao in 2018 discovered. We also focus on Ghana because in Ghana, the Ghana Statistical Service has found that about a quarter of secondary school people live without at least one of their parents due to international migration. Next slide. So this research is based on a longitudinal qualitative research with 38 children of international migrants in Ghana, and the data collection took us 15 months within 2018 and 2019. First, we sampled participants from the TICRA data sets, and this was a research that was conducted among young people in junior high school and senior high school. And the study took the consent of the young people who would like to be part of follow-up studies. Hence, we tracked those who gave their consent to the project, and we first met them for in-depth interviews and subsequently for informal conversations and observations. With our data, we analyzed it thematically through inductive and deductive reasoning. Next slide, please. This slide gives us some characteristics about the research participants, and here I would like to highlight that the age ranges between 16 to 23 years old, and all the participants were SHS graduates. Next slide, please. Before the young people entered into SHS, they did not have access to their mobile phones, so they had to always engage with their parents through other adults, be their caregivers or people in the neighborhood. And as young people had to go through adults or sometimes non-relatives to call their migrant parents, this communication was intermittent and had to be scheduled. When they got to senior high school, boarders were permitted to use the school phones at specific times to call their parents at a fee. Here, some of them who had some network, such as siblings or teachers who could give them their phones, still spoke to their parents through these adults' phones. When they graduated from senior high school, some of them received phones as gifts from their parents or extended family members. We find in our data that, interestingly, when parents give phones to one or more of their children and do not give to others, one of our participants commented that such parents try to put enmity between these siblings. Next slide, please. So regarding youth agency and transnational communication, we observe that the young people rely on their technical abilities, their ability to observe time and timing for meaningful communication. They engage their parents through silence and brevity. The content of the communication was strategic, and sometimes through migrant siblings or siblings in Ghana. Next slide, please. So I will take you through these specific themes. Could you please highlight this? Make this big for me, sorry. So here I am showing you Facebook and WhatsApp because they were strategically used by some young people to be able to stay connected to their migrant parents. By using Facebook to search and find long-distance parents for WhatsApp intimacy, some children's story depicted how public and private online spaces merge to sustain transnational relationships in varying ways. Regarding technical abilities, those with illiterate parents preferred sending voice messages instead of text message, as Marble comments here. Next slide. We also observed that the monitoring and surveillance functionality of WhatsApp or communication tools gave these young people the opportunity to also stay connected. But in this case, non-response meant that to some of them, the parents were ignoring them or greater suspicion of being abandoned. Next slide. Time and timing was strategic in the sense that some of them took note of the times that their parents had a lot of time to engage them fruitfully or meaningfully. And this was usually during weekends or after working hours. Here we also see that when the young people receive unpleasant messages, even sometimes comments about their hair or how they look, because these parents have observed them through WhatsApp status or things like that, they chose sometimes never to reply or reply later when they have been able to allow such messages to sync properly. Next slide. Silence was strategic in the sense that when the young people do not want to stay connected for various reasons or wish to stop communicating for as long as they wish, sometimes years, young people, just like their parents, employ the strategy. Next slide. The content of the message was used. Brevity is used to express unhappiness, and in this case, unlike silence, the young people feel forced by their caregivers, including one of their biological parents in the sending country, to engage their migrant parent, and hence they would respond to questions or engage their migrant parents in very short amounts of time. Next slide. Content of the message. In this case, when young people perceive that their parents have very limited time to engage with them, they make sure that they send messages when they have request or a need, and they also try to monitor their parents to receive information about such requests. Next slide. Connecting through local siblings was done in this case to avoid those problems that arise through direct communication. Here, these siblings were acting as mediators between the local siblings and the migrant parents. Next slide. In the case of the migrant siblings, young people who had difficulties and sometimes wanted to still remain connected to their parents chose to engage these parents through their siblings who have joined their parents overseas. And Sona's case here gives us an example. In this case, Sona could not call his mother directly due to her technological illiteracy. Hence, he preferred to call the sister so that the sister could give the phone to his mother for communication. Next slide. So this presentation briefly shows how stay-at children express their agency through ICT such as WhatsApp to remain connected to their migrant parents. Here we report about the inequalities that exist within media ecologies and specifically for transnational families. And we show that as compared to most research that depicts children of migrants in the origin countries mostly as passive actors in the transnational field, these children show their agency through various ways that they communicate with migrant parents, despite the problems that are sometimes associated with the agency. Therefore, we see the need for more research into transnational communication and sibling relationships, as some of our findings shows, and also the emotional tools that are connected to transnational communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Onallia, for this very interesting presentation. Before we go to the next presentation, I would like to ask, does anyone have any urgent questions before the discussion session at the end? That's a no, I think. So thank you again, Onallia. And now we are going to our second presenter, who is Obert Tawodzera from the University of Sheffield. He's also a PhD student, and he will present about Zimbabwean transnational families and how they negotiate transnational aged care through new technologies.
Thank you, Magda, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Obert Tawodzera. I'm a PhD student at the University of Sheffield. My presentation will focus on Zimbabwean migrant care workers and how they negotiate aged care arrangements with their overseas family members. The presentation is also part of my PhD, so I would welcome some feedback on it. So I'll present some of the findings from my PhD study. Next slide, please. So I'll start by giving you a brief introduction to the literature around transnational families and new technologies, as well as around migrant care workers. So we know for definite that the number of migrants are leaving their own families to work in the care sector in developed countries has been well documented in many scholarly research. This actually reflects quite a broad global trend on relying on migrant care workers to mitigate the so-called aged care crisis that is currently being experienced in many developing countries. So these migrants who provide these essential services to the elderly people are also simultaneously embedded in relations of care with their own families back home. That might be back home, and they also have families over here. So this simultaneity of their family life is given rise to what is referred to as the transnational families, in which members reside in different countries, but still across distance through new technologies. The transnational family literature has also demonstrated how they exchange various social, cultural, and emotional support and care, and also other social and economic remittances across borders. And these practices are perceived to have been made possible by, of course, the advancement in new technologies that could be ICTs or transportation technologies. So now migrants are said to be have got this polymedia environment that is available to them to enable them to communicate with their families back home. And some of the media that is out there that they are using are things like Skype, FaceTime, WhatsApp video calling, which gives them that face-to-face communication with their family members, actually bringing in the issues of our co-presence. And next slide, please. So, with the coming in of new technologies, obviously there's been a lot of celebration and romanticizing the way these technologies are empowering for migrants. And we know for definite that if you look deeper and you dig deeper within the literature, it shows that these new technologies, they are not necessarily positive in transnational caregiving relationship because of their different generation, cultural values, and access, which shape how these new technologies are taken up by people. These might not be compatible with each other, or they might actually generate some inequalities. Another example that it's shown how these inequalities manifest themselves through new technologies was a study done by Parenas in 2005, where she researched transnational communication amongst Filipino families, and actually showed that new technologies actually tie migrant mothers to their traditional gender roles. Next slide, please. So my PhD, like I said, was looking at Zimbabwean migrant care workers caring at a distance using new technologies. So the study itself, I utilized a qualitative and multi-sited methodological framework with in-depth interviews as the main data collection technique. So I interviewed 10 Zimbabwean migrant care workers here in the UK, mostly in the Yorkshire and Humberside region. That was done in between April and October of 2019. Then I matched some of the family members. I matched their family members who were back in Zimbabwe. So some of the participants allowed me to go and interview their family members in Zimbabwe. So I followed their story to the family members in Zimbabwe. So I went to Zimbabwe between October and November 2019, where I interviewed 11 left behind family members. So all the interviews lasted 45 minutes to over 1 hour, with the data recorded, transcribed, coded, and analyzed thematically. Next slide, please. So you might want to ask me why the focus on Zimbabwean migrant care workers, and also why the focus on their overseas family members. Zimbabwean migrants form a significant proportion of migrants working in the UK social care sector. And there's been a few studies that have been conducted in detailing their presence in the sector. Of course, there is a lack of research on how they reconcile paid care work and unpaid. The other thing also was geographic. I also wanted to bring in the African flavor to studies on transnational. Most of these studies that have been done have been conducted on Europe, Latin America, and South Asia, and thus there is a lack of research on Africa. So a few studies that have actually looked at Africa and transnational caregiving mostly focus on childcare arrangements, and most of these have been done in West Africa, like the one that's Onallia has just talked about in the last presentation. So the Zimbabwean case also kind of offers us a vantage point of exploring the digital divide between those living in developed countries and those from less developed countries. Next slide, please. So one of my main findings with the use of new technologies was that they helped separated family to actually manage critical health moments. And these critical health moments are moments that can be triggered by specific problematic health events, which could include an illness that demands an immediate and adequate response. And in the literature, they've been also called the care crisis, when a healthcare crisis confronts the family. So for families living apart, actually, a critical health moment required instrumental coordination and the execution of several goals by people at a distance. So I argue that the way transnational families respond to critical health moments actually provide us with a comprehensive lens of analyzing how new technologies mediate caring and the fostering of relationships of obligation across borders. And from the findings, we find that communication via new technologies becomes actually a more salient form of transnational care, allowing family members a virtual home to discuss and execute care arrangements for their elderly relatives in the face of physical separation. And this also helps people to deal with different emotions that come out as a result of a critical health moment unfolding. Next slide, please. So I'll introduce you to Charity's story. Charity was one of my participants. Charity, she's a Zimbabwean migrant care worker living in Yorkshire, and she lives with her husband who's in the army, and they are 3 children. Charity also takes care of her mother, who is in Zimbabwe, and she does so with the help of her siblings, 2 sisters in Zimbabwe and a brother who's in the United States. So when her mother had a health care and was rushed to hospital for surgery, Charity found she actually spoke profoundly about WhatsApp. So WhatsApp, she and her siblings actually pooled resources together through communication on WhatsApp. So her two sisters who are in Zimbabwe were acting as the ones who were there to provide the needed hands-on care. Charity and her brother, who's in the United States, were there to provide the much needed currency for their mother's medical bill. Through the technology, enabled Charity and their siblings to be involved in her mother's care from a distance. She indicated that she would have preferred to be on the ground, that is, to be there to take care of her mother physically, because the literature also emphasizes the importance of visits when health crises like this occur. However, it's not usually the case that people like Charity can travel because at that particular time she said she did not have enough money, and on top of that her husband was away with the army. So this actually shows some limitations of new technologies. I asked her how she felt, how that made her feel that when she couldn't travel, and this is what she said. She said it was hard, she felt hopeless and was depressed because she couldn't be there. Next slide, please. Besides managing critical health moments, I also found that new technologies were helpful in the facilitation of cross-border material care, special financial remittances. So the remittances from the UK, they were the primary source of transnational material care of the elderly. The remittances that were earned by migrants, they were standing in for the non-existent state care, because the public health care in Zimbabwe is barely functional, and many people now rely on the private healthcare sector, whose prices are priced in US dollars. That places them actually out of reach for many ordinary Zimbabweans who earn in local currency. So migrants like Charity and her brother from the last slide that I talked about actually work hard to send money home for the upkeep of their families. So this shows like those struggles of the cost of healthcare, that they are part of the everyday experiences of the elderly care for families in Zimbabwe, to such an extent that sentences that are sent by migrants are now being actually could be seen as the currency of care, as been said by Singh and colleagues. So one of the migrant care workers I talked to, named Kuda, also talked about how the doctors demanded money when his father went into hospital when he needed a cancer operation. I'm not going to read that slide. Next slide, please. So besides them to send a lot of money, needing to send money for the healthcare, they also praised the new technologies, of course, for making it easy to send money. And they actually said, most participants actually said new technologies is the way of sending and receiving remittances. So money was generally sent through World Remit, MoneyGram, Western Union, and some was sent through what's called EcoCash, which is a mobile money transfer that is now popular in Zimbabwe. And money was sent generally monthly, but with extra funds in times of a care crisis. And Blessing as a quotation here actually sums up, illustrates people to use to send money than it was before. As it says, I used to use Western Union or MoneyGram, and these were not in my town. I used to take a bus to Leeds. That's where I'll be able to send money. It was quite an effort, especially when there was an emergency. Nowadays, I just use an app, which is called World Remit. I can send money from anywhere. I just need my phone and enough funds in the bank, and they will get it instantly. Next slide, please. Of course, while remittances and the nature of money transfer through new technologies was welcomed by most participants, some, however, indicated that these new technologies were a key factor in generating pressure for them to remit. If you can read Melusi's statement there, which actually indicate that technologies are not to empowering for the migrants, but they can also be objects of exploitation and serve as a burden to migrants who are required to fulfill their caring responsibilities through remitting. Next slide, please. Concluding remarks then, actually from the findings, participants' account show some positive examples of new technology-mediated interventions to help families stay connected in the context of migration. And both migrants and their left-behind family members, they believe that despite the distance between them, their family lives actually have been enriched by new technologies. And indeed, the findings show that some of these technologies and the media applications like WhatsApp encourage stronger emotional connection within families. And this can help those at a distance to creatively and efficiently transmit their assistance. And also, new technologies have improved the way families send, receive, and use remittances. Next slide, please. However, I do contend here that these new technologies actually they fall short when a distant care crisis involving an older family member confronts the family. For migrants, the findings highlight that the use of new technology during a care crisis cannot entirely relieve the emotional pain and guilt of not being on the ground to offer that social and what's could be emotionally appropriate hands-on care to their sick parents. This also confirms some of the findings from other studies that new technologies do not necessarily translate into greater sense of caring. So physical co-presence or being on the ground and providing hands-on care is still a highly preferred way of performing care duties, as has been found elsewhere. And then contrary to the literature that new technologies empower migrants, they also sometimes create heightened responsibilities and potential stress on the migrants who's now easily accessible and despite the geographic distance. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Obert. That was a very interesting presentation, and I am sure we are going to have a very stimulating discussion at the end of the 4 presentations. And now I would like to invite our third presenter, Professor Loretta Baldassar. Loretta is a professor in the discipline group of anthropology and sociology at the University of Western Australia, and she's a director of the Social Care and Aging Living Lab. She's going to talk about digital citizenship and mobility rights and how care inequalities affect older migrants and left behind parents.
Thank you, Magda. As has been said, my name is Loretta Baldassar. I'm from the University of Western Australia, and I'd like to thank the conference organisers for the opportunity to present, and also a special thanks to the technicians for making this possible, Kelly Davidge and Xander Green in particular. And I'm delighted to be presenting in this session with the work of new rising stars in transnational family research. The experiences of transnational families and caring across distance have become, I think, much more familiar to people due to the current pandemic. When I first started presenting this work at interdisciplinary conferences, 20 years ago now, my main challenge was often convincing people that it's possible to exchange care across distance. And that's because care is normatively and ontologically, as a concept, understood as requiring physical proximity. And I think in the current context of the pandemic, caring across distance has become a much more ubiquitous and shared challenge, or at least non-proximate forms of care or virtual forms of care. So I think this research brings a real resonance to contemporary experiences. And I'm speaking to you from Perth, and we're in the middle of a thunderstorm and rain, which is extraordinary for Perth at the best of times. So I hope that you can hear me okay. Of course, I wrote the abstract for this presentation before the pandemic, but I am going to try and reflect on the relevance to the current pandemic through the talk. Next slide, please. So the aim of this paper is to highlight two key dimensions of care inequalities, in particular from the perspective of older migrants. So we heard a wonderful paper by Onallia on younger people, and then Obert's on carers. So this one focuses on older migrants, and these two key dimensions of care inequalities are digital citizenship and mobility rights. And I've written elsewhere about how any discussion of caregiving and mobilities in contemporary family life leads directly to an analysis of the role of digital technologies. And both previous papers show this really clearly. Similarly, the role of digital technologies is central to any discussion of caring for and by older adults in the current pandemic. In both cases, what we know as the digital divide, which highlights the relatively limited digital literacy and access of certain older adults, including their need for facilitated digital citizenship, that is, a digital access facilitated by others, usually their children and grandchildren. So it's an intergenerational endeavour. This is a key challenge. More recently, Laura Merler, Majella, and I highlight how the current political focus on restrictionist policies, characterised by immobilising regimes of highly conditional mobility, is dramatically affecting the context under which transnational families maintain their caregiving relationships. Similarly, the pandemic imposed constraints on travel, including for family care visits, mirrors some of the restrictions facing, in particular, migrants on temporary visas. So in this paper, I explore this double care jeopardy of digital and mobility exclusion in the lives of older migrants, looking at one, the uneven access and capacity to use digital technologies to engage in virtual forms of care. And this is really a response to the crippling levels of isolation that we find in the experience of older people, particularly those in residential care. Secondly, limitations and restrictions on the capacity to move across borders to engage in visits for proximate care. And this can be external, structural, like visa constraints, but also the increasing lack of mobility that individuals experience as they grow older. So for this paper, due to time constraints, I'm going to focus on grandparent visits. Next slide, please. Just a quick note on data and methods. The ideas and data and ethnographic case studies in this paper are drawn from 3 interconnected projects. The first and main project is the Australian Research Council funded Ageing and New Media project, co-led with Associate Professor Raelene Wilding from Deakin. This project explored the role of distant support networks in the well-being of older people across several country of birth groups, as seen on the slide, including older people living in residential care and older people living at home. And it's from this work that we are developing the notions of digital kinning and digital homing, which feature in the analysis of this paper. As you can see on the slide, we built a fabulous team of researchers. And for the purposes of this paper, I want to highlight the contributions of Dr. Katrina Stevens, who collected the China-born parent visitor case studies, which I draw on, and Hien Nguyen, whose PhD thesis, Growing Older Overseas, How Older Vietnamese-Born People Are Experiencing Aging and Aged Care in Australia, also includes a sample of parent visits. And I led data collection for the Italy-born sample, which also includes parent visitors. Next slide, please. The second project of relevance actually grew out of the ARC work, which led to the establishment of a new research entity, the Social Care and Ageing Living Lab, the SAGE Lab we call it. Put simply, we've been applying our findings about the ways transnational families exchange care and the importance of distant care networks to issues of ageing, especially in residential care. For example, as the images on the slide show, we've been running digital literacy projects in care facilities to help combat isolation and developing online care communities, which have been particularly relevant during the COVID lockdown. Next slide, please. The third project features temporary migrants, which is a growing component or dimension of migration. Next slide, please. Just a bit of background on parent migrants, and I'm going to focus on parent migrants. Not a lot has been written about them. In Australia, there are currently two parent migration streams, the non-contributory visa stream, which costs $6,000 and has a waiting period of over 30 years. So it's a victim of administrative slowdown and not many people manage to get on it. The alternative is the contributory parent visa, which costs $50,000 and very few people can afford it. So most people use the parent visitor scheme, which also has costs, and mobility constraints. So in general, it requires parents to be outside of Australia for 6 months in every 18. Next slide, please. I'm not going to talk about the politics behind these restrictions, which will be covered in a related paper that Majella Kilkey is presenting in another session. But this issue has been in the news in Australia a lot, with the kinds of constraints that require people to leave the country in order to process their visas, to get new visas and so on. But we'll quickly move on to the next slide. What I want to highlight instead is the overarching policy context that informs this research, with its emphasis on ageing in place. Now, while a focus on proximate forms of support is very important to ageing well, what it does is it overlooks the role played by distant support network members, and therefore it has overlooked the role of digital technologies and the importance of visits in supporting care across distance for those older people whose primary support networks are distant ones. Now, it's interesting to see how this policy develops in response to the pandemic, where non-proximate forms of support have become critical. So I'm very interested to see how this shapes policy in the future and whether it benefits transnational family members as a result. But in the time remaining, I want to present a couple of case studies that feature the importance of digital technologies and mobility rights, and introduce the notions of digital kitting and digital homing. Next slide, please. So the first grandparent visitor case is Mrs. Ma. She retired at 50 and was settling into a relaxed retirement, exploring new hobbies in China. However, the rhythm of her life changed dramatically after becoming a grandparent. Now she regularly travels back and forth to Perth, supporting her daughter, who runs a small business and needs lots of childcare. Over just 4 years, she has made 8 visits to Perth, taking turns with her son-in-law's parents every 3 months. So these grandparents in China share the care of their grandparents. Such care sharing arrangements are common among grandparent visitors, and they balance the constraints of the temporary visitor visa requirements. Mrs. Ma describes her regular practices of using ICTs and WeChat, the Chinese social media platform, as a lifeline, because this what we call digital kinning, the practices and processes of using these technologies to stay in touch with kin and friendship networks overseas, allows her to maintain a social identity in both places, back in China and in Perth. She also uses these digital kinning practices locally with a new network of friends, other Chinese visiting grandparents, as it happens. And she also engages in what we call digital homing practices, where she uses WeChat feeds to follow homeland news as a source of entertainment and relief from daily life, which she describes as really monotonous and exhausting, so much childcare work. So in contrast to Mrs. Ma, there were other participants in the study with very poor digital literacy skills and limited facilitated digital access who had lost contact with their networks in China and as a result experienced extreme social isolation in the homes, in the suburban homes in Perth of their parents, of their children and grandchildren. They were sort of at the mercy of their adult children in terms of their social life. What they did do, though, was all participate in some degree of what we call digital homing practices, where they were live streaming Chinese cultural content, films and TV series, for example, which for them was a very important way of maintaining their social identities and cultural connections. Next slide, please. While Mrs. Ma travelled to Australia to provide care and support to her migrant daughter and children, another feature of parent visiting case studies is exemplified in the case of Rina, an Italian grandmother who travelled to Australia not to give care so much as to receive emotional and moral support from her daughter after the sudden death of her husband left her quite depressed. This is quite a challenging story where at the end of the 3-month visit, that was the limit of her visitor visa at the time, Rina had a fall and broke her hip and ended up in hospital in Perth. This resulted in hospital-acquired pneumonia, and she became gravely ill and began to die. Despite attempts to request a change to the visa category, she was not given permission to extend her stay, and as a result, the daughter had to take her back to Italy. The airline had no problem with this gravely ill woman taking this flight. Back in Italy, the daughter tried to put Rina in an aged care facility. She was unable to find one that would take her because there was no local additional support because the daughter lives in Australia. So in the end, the daughter had to set up this daily digital kinning set of practices with hired care workers in the home. And we talk about how through this set of practices, these care workers become like kin, which I know is a disputed concept. And we can talk about that if we have time in the questions. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, I want to present these notions of digital kinning and digital homing around to highlight ways of facilitating and expanding the support networks of older people, particularly those who are at risk of isolation, and to also emphasize that this kind of practices do often require facilitation by others. Next slide, please. I'm interested in people's comments on our use of the term kinning, which we've employed from the anthropology of adoption, where it's used to refer to the practice or the process of making non-kin kin, bringing people into networks of support. And we think this is particularly relevant in migration settings, and also particularly relevant in aged care settings where the idiom of kinship is often used around care. Next slide, please. So some final summing up points. The notion of digital kinning is an attempt to capture this process of becoming kin in transnational settings, but also in settings characterised by reduced social network support, as in residential care contexts. There is also now the question of whether and how it might be relevant to social distancing context in the pandemic. A related conceptual question is whether defining care in terms of kinning is a useful way of refining what we mean by care in transnational contexts. This responds to a common critique of the notion of transnational care as being too broad. So rather than arguing that every transnational communication is a type of care, we ask, is it more appropriate to define transnational communication exchange in terms of kinning processes? Care is central to our conceptualization, and we draw on the feminist ethics of care work. And in a related paper in another session, Majella Kilkey is presenting some collaborative work we have done on the need to expand the feminist ethics of care to include a transnational ethics of family care. So we are still thinking through our conceptualization of care and kinning. And I'll leave the presentation there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Loretta. That was a very thought-provoking presentation, and we are going to have lots of questions at the end. And now I would like to invite our fourth presenter, Dr. Veronika Klok-Nowak, who is a researcher at the Center of Migration Research at the University of Warsaw. She's going to present about her research with Polish grandparents and how these grandparents maintain ties with grandchildren across distance and national borders.
Hello. Welcome, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. My name is Veronika Klok-Nowak, and in this final presentation of the session, I would like to contextualize international or even transcontinental migration, also in the context of internal migration, internal mobility. My talk is entitled Polish Grandparents in the Age of Mobility, Maintaining Ties with Grandchildren Across Geographical Distance and National Borders. And it stems from the project that I lead. Next slide, please, with the project details. This is also today's presentation is the result of my joint work with Martin Piotrowski and Sylwia Tymosiuk, who are part of the project team and are crucial in the quantitative analysis that I'm going to talk today about. The project originated from my interest in transnational families. Next slide, please. In which there is a large literature on care in transnational families and intergenerational relations in such families experiencing migration. And I think all this background is well known to anyone interested also in today's conference. The grandparents are one of the figures that are quite important in this literature. So we learn a lot about flying grannies and zero-generation migrants, about grandparents who are engaged in care, in childcare in such families, either occasionally or on long-term basis, who travel to care or who care for migrant children back in their country of origin. And we also learn in this literature how grandparents, how older people use ICT technology and experience this polymedia that has already been talked here about, and this virtual co-presence of family members. And while reading about all of this, I started to have this puzzle. Next slide, please. Is grandparenting across border really that special, that different from contemporary grandparenting in regular families and in families that are separated by internal within country mobility? That was my puzzle back in 2018 when I started this project. And of course, this year's pandemic has changed everything also for the people who are resident in one country or even in one town in terms of having to rely on technology to maintain ties. But back then, that seemed important to compare transnational families and within country families. And next slide, please. So I had to go back to sociology of families and look how grandparenting and distance are seen by this literature. And for example, in Miller and others noticed that geographic proximity clearly influences grandparenting, and in different in families experiencing different levels of proximity, different grandparenting styles, ways of maintaining ties and activities that grandparents have with grandchildren differ. They are different when they live close to each other, and different ones dominate when they are away from each other. A lot of attention was put to grandparents in non-traditional situations. When grandparents de facto have to become foster carers, when the middle generation, parental generation, cannot care for children. Yet, I wanted to have a more general look, not only look at these non-traditional situations that are so important in terms of social work and social services, but do not constitute the experience of grandparenting for majority of families where there are all these generations involved. Next slide, please. The context of my study is Poland and Polish society, where grandparenting is very widespread experience of older people, and also there are strong familialistic norms, strong norms about responsibilities of grandparents towards grandchildren. There's a normative expectation of grandparents, especially grandmothers, to look after their grandchildren, and it is also practiced usually by quite a large share of older persons, including some who experience co-residence in one household with the grandchildren. At the same time, all these familialistic norms are challenged by large immigration from Poland and fast population aging. Next slide, please. So for today's analysis, I focus on the question if and how grandmothers and grandfathers' practices across national borders differ from the practices at a distance but within national borders, and from the locally experienced grandparenting practices. I will inquire into the frequency of face-to-face meetings with grandchildren and compare it with the frequency of remote communication with grandchildren. And by remote communication, I mean conversations over phone communicators. I'm interested in to what extent these remote communication devices are used to overcome geographical distance, not only in transnational families, not only to overcome the international borders. Next slide, please. My source of data, if you could zoom in to this complex slide. Our data is the survey, which was collected in December 2019 and mostly in January 2000. We had 1,000 respondents aged from 50 to 89 with at least one grandchild, and we recruited 3 subsamples. One was people who had at least one grandchild abroad. We call them further on transnational grandparents. One who had no grandchild abroad. The second subsample, people who had no grandchild abroad, living in Poland at the distance of over 25 kilometers. And the third subsample, people who only had grandchildren within this 25-kilometer range, we'd call them local grandparents. And for each of our respondents, we collected individual level data on all of their grandchildren. And for some of the grandchildren, up to 3 per respondent, we have very detailed data on contact and joint activities, joint practices. So we have detailed data on 1,674 what I call grandparent-grandchild dyads, pairs, experience of a grandparent with a particular grandchild. And within this pool of dyads, we have, of course, different proportions, because even our transnational grandparents could also have other grandchildren in Poland. Next slide, please. If we could skip that, that's for if someone had any questions about the phone, please. So first, to tie maybe with the focus of other presentations in today's session, I wanted to show the digital resources of each of this group of grandparents. We asked them whether they had at home and could use for their private aims a tablet, a PC or a desktop computer, a laptop or a smartphone, understood as a mobile phone allowing to use internet and applications. And we could see that the grandparents who have a grandchild abroad are relatively the ones with the best access to IT resources, but differences are not very striking. And it was also quite puzzling that the ones who had only local grandchildren would come second in their digital resources. But one of my a possible explanation is that actually they share some of the resources in the household with the younger members, because being a local grandparent may mean also being a co-resident grandparent. Next slide, please. So moving from the level of grandparents respondents now to the level of dyads, of the pairs, our dependent variables for two models are the variables on contact frequency in the last 12 months. We measured in-person contacts, so face-to-face meetings, and remote contact, meaning conversations, talking over telephone or internet. And we can see that the distribution of frequency is different for in-person contact and remote contact. And basically in our analysis, we have models for each of these dependent variables. Next slide, please. So the first model is about in-person contact. And what is, I think, the most important here is that we found out that living at over 25 kilometers or abroad does not affect the probability of lack of in-person meetings, but it does lower probability of meeting often and very often in comparison to our reference category. And next slide, please. So to concentrate today on our second model, which is about remote contact, we can see here that living at 25 kilometers away or abroad, of the residence of the grandchild at 25 kilometers away or abroad, reduces the probability of no remote conversations, but it also lowers the probability of connecting very often. And towards the bottom of our table, we see that using internet technology, having access to internet technology to these digital resources by a grandparent, reduces the probability of lack of contact and increases the probability of very frequent remote contact with the grandchild. Next slide, please. Here we focus on the impact of the grandchild's location on the predicted probability of contact frequency, both in-person contact and remote contact. And we can see that the pattern is different for in-person contact and for remote contact. If we look at the remote contact, Distance and living abroad reduce the risk of never using remote contact. But with the local grandchildren, the frequency of no remote contact and the very frequent remote contact are the highest. So, like the two opposite categories of frequency are more prominent than in the relations in the dyads with distant and abroad, and with the grandchildren who live at a distance and abroad. Next slide, please. So to conclude, in over 95% dyads, regardless of location, meeting in person at least once per year has been secured. So looking from our today's 2021 perspective, the pandemic may deprive families even of that one special meeting per year due to social isolation and grandchildren person contact, but only in the case of the more frequent contact patterns, often and very often. It did not affect this once per year, the probability of once per year meeting. As regards the remote contact, frequent remote contact, once per week or more, is the most probable for both local and distant grandchildren, but not for the ones abroad, which I think reduces this impression of popularity of virtual co-presence for transnational parents. This everyday contact is not actually the one experienced the most often in these dyads. And also co-residence increases the access to devices and intensifies remote contact for grandparents. We can think of the fact that co-residents both give access to the resources, devices shared with younger co-resident generations, but also it increases the occasions, the need to contact every day on everyday matters, simply shopping, cooking, etc. Without co-residence, there's sometimes no need for such everyday remote contact. Next slide, please. And of course, I have now, when I look at my pre-COVID-19 survey, I can only regret I have not designed it and started it as a panel study, but who could have imagined? We also need to dig deeper into our data, which gives us the possibility to study separately relations with small grandchildren, with adolescents, and with adult grandchildren. And I think adult grandchildren are important because they are kind of independent from parents. They may maintain their ties with grandparents independently from parents. They don't need the mediation, and they may even be able to support their grandparents by themselves. And of course, I presented here only the associational solidarity dimension. We also have data on other dimensions. And on the normative level. So there's still a lot to do with the data, but I hope that this study on the frequency of contact in different family settings across distance and borders is a good start. Next slide, please. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to any questions and comments.
Thank you, Veronica, for this very interesting presentation. And now I would like to invite our discussant, Professor Majella Kilkey, to add her comments to this presentation. Majella is a professor of social policy in the Department of Sociological Studies at the University of Sheffield, and she's also a co-director of the Migration Research Group there.
Thank you very much, Magda, for that introduction. And what a wonderful set of papers. Thank you, Onallia, Obert, Loretta, and Veronica. It's impossible for me to do justice to the richness of those 4 presentations, either individually or collectively. I will simply try to offer a few reflections on what I've heard. I thought it was fantastic that we were hearing about the voices and experiences of those that are usually less well attended to in migration studies and in transnational family studies more broadly. So we heard from Onallia and her focus on young people's experiences. And we heard from Obert and Loretta about older people. And in both situations, they're often also that category that belong to, the so-called left behind. And because of their, on the one hand, their youth, on the other hand, because of their older age, and also because they're often not moving themselves, although Loretta's story of the grandparent mobility complicates that, but these groups are generally constructed as being left behind in migration projects, that they're often constructed as passive and dependent in the migration story and in care scenarios, transnational care scenarios. What we heard from Onallia, though, was the agency of young people in care relationships when they're happening transnationally. And I really liked your emphasis, Onallia, on the temporal strategies that young people use to try to navigate relationships with their parents transnationally, to try to manage those relationships. So we had a real sense of the agentic nature of young people in these relationships, which are occurring across borders. It would have been really interesting, and perhaps Obert can say something more about that, to hear about the experiences of older people in relation to the technology. So I know that Obert interviewed the older family members in Zimbabwe, and I'd be really interested to learn their relationship to the technology in those transnational family relationships. What we heard from Loretta was the constraints on older people's involvement in transnational care relationships because of challenges such as digital literacy. And I would just be interested to learn more from Obert whether that's also the case when we look at the African context. And that brings me on to my second point about what we were hearing about in the presentation. So not only did we hear about people, their voices, the experiences of people who are less well attended to in research, but we were also hearing about places that have been less visible, less researched, and in particular Ghana in Zimbabwe. And we can justify a focus on other places because of a lack of empirical work. But I wonder, could we think more about what we actually learn by turning our eyes to places like countries in Africa, Ghana and Zimbabwe, which have been less researched? What do the experiences from those countries contribute to our knowledge about the relationship between technology and transnational family and care relationships? And that brings me back to the question to Obert, because I wonder, is the experience of technology over time, has that been very different in an African context? So the uptake of ICTs, has that happened much more rapidly? Evolution of technology has been slower, has been faster. Key stages in technological change perhaps have been missed out by large numbers of people in an African context. So the landline probably didn't assert itself to the same degree as it did in other places. And therefore, what does that mean then for people's relationship to technology, including older people? So are older people in the African context more likely to take up these new digital technologies than they are, let's say, in a European context? I also liked Onallia's use of the notion of ecology when she was talking about media and it was on a slide, media ecology. We didn't hear much because of the shortness of the presentation about why Onallia decided to choose that concept of ecology. But I think it's a really interesting concept for us to work with. In particular, what had inspired me to think about was the relationship between the media ecology and other ecologies that are relevant to the story of care across borders. So I was thinking about, firstly, the care ecology. I was wondering how the interaction between kind of the role of media, the availability of ICTs, potentially expands the care ecology and makes more complicated the care relationships and care networks. So we heard a little bit about sibling relationships, so the expansion of care networks beyond kind of a dyad to kind of multiple members of a care network, often engaging simultaneously. And this seems to relate to Loretta's really interesting concept of kin and digital kinning. So how does the media ecology transform the care ecology? And to what extent does that then require us to introduce kind of new conceptualizations, such as that of digital kinning? The media ecology is situated within the care ecology that, as we heard, is characterized by inequalities and asymmetries. So age was very present in the presentations that we had, and I also wondered about the role of gender in those patterns of inequalities and asymmetries. And I think we're also hearing about different levels of inequalities and asymmetries, and it might be useful and helpful to think about those that operate at a kind of a micro level of the family, a meso level, and a macro level. So we know within families there will be tensions and inequalities based on potentially generation, based on gender. And at the meso level, we were hearing about inequalities, that we could locate inequalities in digital literacy, but also Onallia raised the point about literacy more broadly. And at the macro level, I think Obert's presentation was really orientating us to think about the global inequalities. So the differences between places in access to healthcare and the resources to pay for that. And as a result, the role that remittances play in transnational care relationships and how technology is transforming people's experiences of remitting, the speed at which that the pressure to remit, the need becomes apparent within a family, the speed at which people back in the home country can receive those resources. And what we also heard about was the relationship not only between the media ecology and care ecology, but Loretta's presentation brought in very strongly the migration policy ecology, if we can call it that. So I think what we were getting a sense of were kind of these almost like ecosystems and the interactions between different components of that ecosystem with media, care, but also migration policy being a critical part. And what was really, I think, interesting coming out of Veronica's presentation was the interaction between physical co-presence and the co-presence that's facilitated by ICTs. And I think, Veronica, your work is opening up many more issues around the complexity of those interactions. Loretta's work in particular in the past has really highlighted the importance of proximate visits, of physical co-presence to recharge, to reboost care relationships. And I think that we need to understand much more the interactions between the physical co-presence and the co-presence facilitated by ICTs. And of course, what we heard about in Loretta's presentation was the inequality. So another dimension to the inequalities, global inequalities in terms of mobilities. So migration policies favour some types of mobility more than they favour others. And age is a key dimension of difference, as Loretta highlighted, in terms of the grandparent visas, but also country of origin will be as well. And so when we think about mobility from the global south to the global north, there are likely to be particular challenges. I think it's quite ironic that this session was titled Inequalities in Care, Global, Local and Transnational Dynamics in an Age of Migration. So when we were developing this session, the planning for this conference session, we were still talking about an age of migration or an age of mobility. And of course, as a number of the presentations have highlighted, in the last year, in the context of the pandemic, global mobility has been severely curtailed as countries have closed borders or tightly controlled their borders. And in this context, I think Veronica's question around the differences between kind of internal care relationships and cross-border care relationships becomes even more salient. So the experience of doing our family relationships through the use of technology, as Loretta said, has become much more ubiquitous. And we would expect in that context transnational families to have actually done quite well, to maybe have been, the most resilient types of family relationships, because of their experience of doing care virtually. But I want to finish by posing that question as to whether those relationships, transnational family relationships, have actually been the most resilient, or whether in the context of the closure of borders and the curtailment of mobility, whether those families have been affected negatively, as all families have been. So I just finish with that kind of question around reflecting on the impact of COVID-19 on transnational family relationships. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you for all the presenters for these most interesting presentations, and for Majella for her very thought-provoking remarks. Now, I would like to invite all presenters and the discussant as well to have a panel discussion. So I think we could start with the presenters reflecting on Majella's remarks. I think Majella commented on all presentations. So I suppose we can go in the order how we presented, starting with Onallia and so on. So just some of the broad themes Majella highlighted were inequalities, media ecologies, the context of the COVID pandemic, and also gender. So I would like to invite now presenters to reflect on this theme. Onallia, could you reflect and to Majella's remarks?
Yeah, thank you, Majella, for all your comments. They are really thought-provoking, and they would help me think more about what I have written so far about the transnational families and ICT. And I like your comment about the interactions between different ecosystems, like the migration policy, care ecology, media ecology, and actually the concept about physical co-presence, because I started my data analysis from that perspective, trying to see how the young people's well-being, in code, is sustained during that period of separation from their migrant parents by looking at how co-presence and digital co-presence, physical co-presence and digital co-presence merge together from their perspective. But it's really complex and I am still looking at it, but I put that down as a later project, and then I zoomed into the digital because the digital co-presence was really prominent in the data as of now. And for me, the interesting part is COVID-19. I like the fact that you say transnational families, I would say, is one of the most resilient, because I don't know other types of family and how they deal with all kinds of separation. But I, as an ethical researcher, I have been following up on my participants due to these ICTs that we still have. I was in Ghana for holidays and I met just a few, but I've been communicating with them right from the beginning until now. And I think the role of ICT has really become relevant in this time, not only for transnational families, but generally for other families. And I think post-COVID, other people who have not been in the shoes of transnational families will better understand this, and this discourse or discussion will get better with time. So this is what I would broadly, and I think my participants are doing well, especially for those who were connected to their parents before, both physically and virtually. And so it always prompts me as a researcher to think about the relevance of pre-migration experience and how that will shape how that shapes people's life along that whole process, whether they reconnect in the destination country or back home or in whatever way. So those who are doing well are still doing well. And fortunately, since the borders open, their parents are able to visit for various reasons and they are really happy about it. But those that their parents have not been in touch continue to live as they've always lived, because these young people look forward to having a better future for themselves. And if they have been able to deal with this up till now, they are still going through the education or whatever endeavor they find themselves. So yeah, this is my reflections for now. Thank you all very much. And if any other of you have comments for me in writing, or if I can have a meeting with you afterwards, I'm really happy to do that. And I look forward to them.
Thank you, Onallia. As I mentioned, I think we go first to the presenters and then we all can add further questions or comments to this discussion. But before that, I would like to ask Obert to reflect on Majella's comments. I think Majella highlighted that you could maybe add a bit on the experiences of older people and how they engage with new technologies.
Thank you, Magda. Thank you, Majella, for the comments. Quite a lot to take on and quite a lot to sort of like digest in the data that I got from Zimbabwe, which was really, really rich, if I can say, because I also got that perspective from older people about how they perceive these new technologies, especially when it comes to caregiving. Of course, there is another research that we've done as part of the sustainable care, of which Majella and Magda are also involved, where we looked at older migrants in the UK and their uptake of new technologies. And we found that there was quite a lot of resistance to the uptake of new technologies. Things like the mobile phone was still not being seen as crucial, because people had landlines in their homes, which they thought still really important, and people were still very conservative about their landlines and wanted to remain using those rather than moving into new technologies. In Zimbabwe, it was a very different case because of the older participants I had. There was only one with a landline in their house, and landlines in Zimbabwe, they are not that popular because we've got people who live in some areas that don't even have landlines, and many households as well in urban areas do not have landlines. And it was only those better off, who could afford to have a landline installed in their houses, were those. But for most, it was to rely on a public telephone booth. And from one of the participants that I spoke to, he spoke about how they used to call a public telephone booth, and then someone would go and relay the message to the family. But now with the incoming of mobile phones, there is quite a huge uptake and by older people of these mobile phones. And of course, there's the need to have the mobile phone in Zimbabwe is become more relevant because of the way money presents. If you follow the news quite a lot in Zimbabwe, you might find that after the hyperinflation of the early 2000s, Zimbabwe has adopted the United States dollar as the currency for doing business. And many people, that US dollar is not easily to go to the bank to get that the physical money itself is really, really hard. So people rely a lot on mobile money. So money just changes hand virtually, and people's money sent through mobile phones, and then you can use that mobile phone for pay and things like that. So that has actually meant people now need to have a mobile phone because it's now used for accessing money and for accessing services, which means that older people now need also to learn to use those mobile phones in order for them to be able to do business. The other thing that also came up was the way migrants have helped those back home to adopt these new technologies. So quite a lot of people talking about sending their old mobile phones back home, and actually mobile phones, tablets, and things like that, and teaching their older people how to use them. And also this diffusion of new technologies. We've got like another participant who actually had to go back home and install an internet broadband in his parents' house so that he can have easy communication with them. So because these parents normally stay within households where there are other younger people who could teach them how to use such technology. So there's been quite a lot of uptake of those technologies. In terms of in the context of COVID-19, well, I wouldn't say much, but to add to what Onallia just said, that now it's even become more relevant to many people to start thinking about how important the use of new technologies, communication, and to think of it as well as a form of care has actually become even more relevant. Before, when I went to Zimbabwe and I was asking older people, what do they think? Do they think that when someone is communicating to them, they're actually caring about them? Of course, there was a bit of question marks still being left there, with most of them actually preferring people to be there to actually show their physical self, to show that they are caring for them. Like older parents were actually preferring that they could have someone to live with to show that they are being cared for. But now, in the context of COVID-19, I'm sure there is likely that changing their minds and actually agreeing that doing care through technology mediation is also a form of caregiving. Thank you.
Thank you, Obert. I would like to ask Onallia, could you reflect a little bit on the Ghanaian context? Majella highlighted that it's very important that we are hearing from the global south. So maybe if you could compare the Ghanaian context, what you experienced in your research, with the one presented by Obert.
So Obert talked more about the adult population who are the parents of the carers who have moved overseas, right? And I looked at the children of migrants in Ghana. And one thing I wanted to comment about something Majella spoke in relation to Obert's presentation is the uptake of ICT in Ghana, because that was my field site. So before 2012, Ghana was described by the Ghana Statistical Service as becoming an information technology society. And this was because 4 out of every 5 households, so this was measured in household, own a mobile phone in 2014 or 2014. And this meant that somebody at the age of 12 years or older, and I think around that time, somebody in the ages of 12 being a Ghanaian and living in Ghana before I moved to the Netherlands recently myself, it was highly unlikely for you to own a phone at that time. So it's probably the caregiver or the father of the house or whoever is the head of that household owns the phone, and everybody has to be tied to it. But interestingly, you see my data where the young people had to arrange this communication through non-relatives. That means that sometimes you have these young people might want to connect with their parents, but maybe due to the aim of the kind of contact they want to engage in, they needed to arrange that through an outsider. So all of these things makes it complex. But the other thing I find interesting is the desire to own phone, to stay connected even when parents are unwilling or disinterested in connecting with these young people. They still get phones through romantic relationships or working to be able to raise the money to get the phone. For instance, I will use the case of Pipi, who is cited in this chapter of my PhD. So Pipi, when he completed SHS, he started working because he got the short contract with a primary school as he was waiting for his results to proceed to post-secondary institution of his choice. And at this time, his mother gave him a phone, but he lost this phone. His parents are both in the Netherlands, so they gave him a phone. And interestingly, this was not a smartphone, so already this was problematic for this child. But the parents wanted him to have this kind of phone so that they could only call him. But he was very much interested in the seeing part of the conversation. And so he worked hard to gather money, buy the phone when he lost this phone. And in the process, he negotiated with his parents to get him a smartphone, but that wasn't working. And they promised to get him another kind of phone which he will not be able to have this WhatsApp conversation. And this bothered this young man so much that it is really highlighted in the data of this chapter. So these are some of the differences between what I think about young people and what Obert presents about the adult population in Zimbabwe. Notwithstanding, I agree with some of the things I've also observed in Ghana, which Obert talked about, in the sense that if these adults or parents of these carers who have moved overseas are in a household where there would be young people who can use this technology, then they will facilitate the communication. So I think one thing that my paper highlights is the role of mediators in all of this transnational communication, and where siblings, in my case, have really played a very important role locally, but also internationally, and for various reasons, which I highlight in the paper.
Thank you very much, Onallia. Now, could I ask Loretta to reflect a bit and maybe expand on the concept of digital kinship and digital kinning?
Yes. First, I just want to comment that I really enjoyed the papers very much. It was a session that really hung together so well. And I might respond to your question about digital kinning through my reflection on some of the discussion already, if that's okay. So I was struck during the presentations by a tension in all of the papers, which I struggle with myself, which is where we tend to conceptually evaluate the virtual co-presence, virtual connectivity in contrast to the proximate, right? We just tend to do it by default. And, you know, what I really liked about Majella's reflections on the media ecology and the care ecology and the policy ecology, if you will, and how your question, how do they interrelate? I think that really helps to push us past that conceptual tendency to implicitly evaluate virtual in contrast to proximate or physical. And the reason I raise that is because why do we have to do that? I mean, I think it's really about the dynamic. What you said, Majella, I can't remember now, but how does the media and care ecology relationship shape care, etc. I really want to, in my own work, get past that, tendency to dichotomize, which I think is a conceptual roadblock. And it's because of our tendency to see the distant as not as good. And of course, the proximate is very important, but we need to understand it in relation to the virtual, I think. I'm not sure if I'm explaining this very well, but for me, that was really interesting in this session. And I think we are living in a digital by default world. And if I were to reflect on, the participants in this very apparently developed world of Australia, although Indigenous people really are not the same access as everyone else, there's a lot of ageism about older people not being interested in technology, not needing technology. All of our sample gives the older people the hand-me-down telephone, which doesn't work, right? That's why you hand it down. And that's implicit, that's, just so ageist in its assumption. And the importance of, therefore, of intergenerational facilitation is just so very real. And my response to the pandemic question is that I think everyone's had an experience of being in something like a transnational family. So maybe it makes transnational families and non-transnational families somehow co-eval. Somehow we're in the world together now. And I had my first second year class last week, and we were reflecting on transnational lives, and the young middle class students were saying, my God, I was just so shocked when the borders closed. I couldn't go anywhere and I needed to get back somewhere. And, that is such an experience of migrants from the developing world and labour migrants from everywhere. And so there's something about the potential of this moment, as we've been saying. But also what makes transnational family and non-transnational families the same in this is this struggle for proximate care. People dying alone, whether their family are in another country or down the road, was what struck me the most. Because I've been working in residential care and no one was allowed in, and the absolute isolation of people in care, in residential care. So all the way back now to digital kinning, really digital kinning emerged from the data on isolation and loneliness and older people, older migrants, from both their capacity to be supported by distant networks and the very real importance of them. Sometimes that's all they had, was distant support networks, and their ingenuity in what we call digital homing, finding that content. They are big adopters of technology, and Obert's, idea of the social remittance of taking home digital technology capacity and knowledge, I think, is really interesting. Migrants teach us about the importance of digital technology, and they are early adopters and they use technology more than non-migrants. But at the same time, the isolation that comes with aging and aging bodies, especially, it's like a double jeopardy in our digital by default world, means that residential care homes don't offer internet connectivity to residents. Maybe now they will post-pandemic, but so digital kinning and digital homing were just concepts for us to think with about these issues. And now we need to test them, and we need other people to test them for us in other contexts to see if they help think about those contexts as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Loretta. And Veronica, can I ask you now to reflect on your presentation and Majella's comments? She highlighted that the complexity of physical co-presence and co-presence facilitated by ICTs. Could you maybe reflect on these?
Yeah, so definitely in my project I wanted to look at these often ignored people and internal within country separation as the ones who experience distance that does not that already hinders frequent physical co-presence. And at the same time, without the legal barrier and also financial barriers of trans-border relations, and I was wondering to what extent also the transnational families and the older people who have families abroad may be these pioneers that spread the skills and the practices of doing family at a distance to the ones who are separated internally. And that is maybe a bit a question for further research. I'm also doing focus groups on the topic because I don't think my survey has captured that enough. But I will still dig into the adoption of these practices in families where grandparents have a mix of family settings. So they experience both having some family abroad and others within the country. And I will look whether the practices that they have with the family abroad somehow affect their practices of meeting and talking virtually with the ones that are at a distance but within the country. Still, I think this possibility of meeting in person is important. We could see it when we asked the grandparents for to assess more emotionally the quality of relationship with the particular grandchild on various dimensions, and the grandchildren abroad with whom the visits and the physical co-presence were the least frequent were the ones missed the most. The experience of missing them on everyday basis was the strongest, while still for the very reason of being able to meet more frequently, the ones who live within country or as close as possible are not the ones with whom missing them is the most the strongest feeling regarding them. And also in the local dyads, the ones who can experience physical proximity the most often, the evaluation on the dimensions of understanding each other well, feeling a very close bond was the highest. And in comparison, the ones separated internally and the transnational dyads, they both were assessed on a similar, a bit lower level. So we could see that still distance was already something that installed a bit lower level of understanding, maybe less occasions to like tune in to boost the relationship, as you Majella used this expression that I liked very much. A visit as an occasion to reboost the relationship. Indeed, Loretta, there's something that is so important. If you have the occasion to reboost, to tune in with your close ones from time to time, then all these physical or even like memories, you don't even need this polymedia. If you have fond memories of someone that you cherish every day, that supports the relationship and the feeling of belonging to the same family, to kinship. So I think the pandemic will be very strong if we are forbidden to meet. And it applies both to transnational families and to the local ones, because if in some countries now, even on the very local level, people cannot meet. Yeah, so this I think will have very devastating consequences. And in my survey, I looked at the digital resources. In principle, it didn't look that bad. Majority of people had either a laptop or a smartphone. Of course, the numbers of people who had these resources fell down with age, and it's probably problematic over the age of 70 or 80. I do have data about them in the survey. I just haven't differentiated today on the age dimension, but still, this may be problematic. We can only be a bit hopeful with the next generation of people aging and also entering grandparenthood will be the generations that had already our working lives and our everyday lives within technology. So it may be better. We might be better prepared to enter this part of our life with our technological tools. And I only wanted to mention that listening to especially what Obert had to say about older people in Zimbabwe, it was so contrasting with my experience from fieldwork with older Poles, where they seemed, well, it's maybe a normative term I shouldn't use, but they seem to live in such backward conditions with their landlines, without a smartphone, waiting for this call on a landline. Probably they would have no idea how to receive money over an app. They would be looking forward to a postman to bring them cash. This form of remittances would be more expected and more understandable for them. So they have a long way to go, or probably for some generations of them, these are things that cannot be overcome. Only the younger generations may age differently, but some of them, I think that maybe they may be lost in terms of intergenerational divide, because simply they already, I think in the psychological way, some of them seemed not to be open to learn these technologies anymore, and that's really sad, because it makes it so difficult to assist them, to facilitate them, if they just decide not to learn.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Veronica. Now, thank you for all presenters for these very fascinating, interesting, stimulating presentations, and for Majella for her comments, which clearly stimulated a very interesting discussion after that. I think we could talk for another, not half an hour, but probably several hours. I know I have a whole list of questions written down that I thought I will have the opportunity to ask, but unfortunately, we don't have any more time on this session. Before wrapping up, I would like to ask if anyone has any urgent questions, what they really, really want to ask before we finish the session. It doesn't seem so. Thank you very much. So I think we have to leave it for the online engagement. We will ask the questions then. So thank you again for all the presenters, Onallia, Obert, Loretta, and Veronica, and for Majella, our discussant. And we would like to ask our online audience to engage with us. As we mentioned before, and as it is described on the website, you can send us your comments, your insights, your questions, and we would be happy to engage with these. So we are looking forward to your comments and feedback. And thank you very much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of the conference.